It's a pleasure for me today to be initiating this conversation with Krishna. My name is Eliane Ubalijoro. I'm a professor of practice at the Institute for the Study for International Development here at McGill. And it's a real joy for me to be talking to Krishna. So Krishna, I'd like you to tell our audience a bit about yourself before we start.
I'm really happy to be here at the Institute for the Study of International Development. Back in India, I'm a professor in science policy at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Currently, I'm here at the Indian Council for Cultural Relations India Studies Chair, teaching a course on science, technology, and international development. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. So let's start directly. So Krishna, you and I have a great interest in science, innovation, and policy. So for people who are watching this and who have never thought about it, why does science, innovation, policy matter? Why should it matter to every single student here at McGill, and why should it matter to every citizen on the planet?
Science and technology, as you are aware, has played a very significant role in building scientific communities and development in various parts of the world. Basically, if you look in terms of the best practices of science, technology, and innovation in some of the countries of Asia, like India, China, and Korea, you will find that many of these countries, which were developing countries about 2 decades back, in the last 2 decades, they have emerged as emerging economies, and some have, like Korea, have become members of the OECD. There are 3 main factors which have enabled these countries. The 3 best practices, or some of the best practices you can take it as. The first is the leadership, which is very, very important. Leadership which is committed to science and technology for development. Leadership which invests money into research and development and building higher education and the whole education sector. The second is building the infrastructure, that is the scientific communities, which is very, very important. I say this because if you take example of India, for instance, it has built up, it has the agriculture science community, and without building agriculture science community, it could not have achieved what is known as the India's Green Revolution, which has solved the food problem. Basically, which is a very good example for Africa, for instance. And if you take the lessons of India and China for Africa, now evolving a food security is nothing but building a agriculture science capability within a country to solving the food problems. And and building agriculture science and agriculture security basically means building technological capacities in entomology, plant physiology, soil science, water, stuff like that, and in the universities, and building science institutions. And without agriculture science community, you will not be able to do that. So India is a very clear example of how we build agriculture infrastructure in agriculture sciences and solve the food problems. The third is the creating a science, technology, and innovation ecosystem, which catalyzes the creativity and innovation. Another example would be Singapore. You take a small country in a span of 2 decades, it has almost now become a developed country, And this is because it has sort of evolved a different science, technology, and innovation strategy in terms of attracting global talents and creating an infrastructure again in at least one niche area, which is the biological sciences. It has invested something like $4 to $5 billion in building about 7 or 8 biological laboratories, which is called the Biopolis, which is going to be the future insurance and the creating wealth from the biological investments into research and development. So Singapore is the third, another example of how committed leadership, building infrastructure in science and technology, and creating an ecosystem, research and innovation ecosystem could evolve your technological capabilities and development in science.
So this is great. So what you're sharing with us is really the fact that there was a vision put in place of something that did not exist before. And this is really what leadership does.
Yeah.
Leadership creates a vision, executes it, and ensures that the storytelling, as well as the execution, the planning, and the leveraging of the different networks needed really allow science to move forward. And so that's the type of leadership that has happened in Asia. And you and I have talked about the pillars of agriculture and health. And so I just want you to speak to African leadership and why innovation and building capacity in health and agriculture should be the basis of African policymakers in terms of growing Africa.
Yeah. When you look into some of the best practices in Asia and try to relate it to some of the African countries, I'm not talking about South Africa, obviously I'm talking about referring to the Middle Africa or the Sub-Saharan Africa and the larger parts of the Africa. The first important thing is that in terms of agriculture and health, a strong policy and a leadership which is investing money into these areas is very, very important. If you look in terms of the post-war period, many of these African countries have not invested enough money into building a local scientific technological capacities at the national level in agriculture and health sciences. And this is the main problem why they are continuously being dependent on the other countries in the world. They are investing something like 0.1% in some sub-Saharan countries to 0.3 or 4%. Then if you relate it to some of the Asian countries which have sort of moved into 1% to 2%, 1% of GDP in terms of India and 2% in terms of China, which is now investing over a prolonged periods of time. Now these are not just the percentages. There is no magic kind of a figure in terms of, but there is a UNESCO insight is there which says that at least 1% of the GDP for a prolonged periods of time will enable the countries to establish a minimum critical size of their infrastructure in science and technology. This is particularly important for Africa, which is completely where 65% of the population are dependent on agriculture. And agriculture security becomes very important, health security becomes very important. So without building a science capacities, you cannot build innovation capacities in terms of health and agriculture.
And so you and I have talked about the idea that when you have that base of health and agriculture put in place, building institutions that promote technology, that promote education in the areas of the sciences becomes the next step. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of India and its technology institutes?
In terms of the technology institutes, the Indian Institutes of Technology, which were basically modeled right from the beginning in the 1950s on MIT model. And here again, the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, was very important, who was committed to building higher education for giving a base to the science and technology based development. So over a period of three or four decades, India was able to systematically promote higher education, engineering education, technological education through the Indian Institutes of Technology, and where some of the important, two important factors were building excellence and the teaching quality. You see, these were the two important aspects. And the third is the kind of the infrastructure which was created for these institutions. So that has sort of led India to attain certain kind of a minimum level of technological capability in terms of engineering education. So over a period of after a period of 3 or 4 decades, you will find that today 80% of India's indigenous software sector is dependent on the kind of the manpower which is coming out from the engineering education, particularly from the Indian Institutes of Technology.
And so that's very interesting, because one also other element is a lot of pharmaceutical products now in Africa actually come from India. And 20, 30 years ago, most of them came from the Western world. And so these changes are happening where Indian brain flow, Indian capacity is spreading all over the world. And I'd like to particularly talk about the case of Indian flow in terms of brain flow to the US. And can you talk about that, please?
In terms of the brain flow and the mobility of professionals, India was bothered about a brain drain in the 80s and up to the 90s. But in the last decade and a half, India is no more bothered about brain drain, but it is more interested in attracting the brain flow, what is known as the reverse brain drain or the brain circulation, which is directly linked to at least two sectors. One is the Indian software sector, and the second is the Indian pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical sector. 22% of the firms in the Silicon Valley are either owned or managed by Indians, which is
significant.
Very significant. And this proportion of Indian professionals who are in the Silicon Valley have a direct bearing on the India's software sector, particularly in Bangalore, in Delhi, in Madras, and some other kind of the innovation sectors. There are two associations. One is the Silicon Valley Indian Professionals Association, and the second is the Indus Entrepreneurs, which are the Silicon Valley based institutions. They have a total impact on the building on Indian software sector, because more than something like 600 to 700 firms are established in the last decade, mainly through the kind of the Silicon Valley connection in India. The second is the biopharmaceutical sector, which is here again is government, the public policies which have protected the kind of the intellectual property rights of the patents, in the pharmaceuticals, which is very important. India has only protected chemical pharmaceutical patents for about 7 years, until 2005, when India became part of the WTO arrangement. So from 1970s to 2005, India protected chemical and pharmaceutical patents only for 7 years, and after 7 years it did reverse engineering and put generic drugs into the market. And this has enabled the Indian pharmaceutical companies to build their technological capabilities. But without government investing into half a dozen chemical and pharmaceutical labs, the public labs, India could not have achieved this kind of a technological prowess in mastering the reverse engineering into pharmaceutical. Now it is getting into from reverse engineering in drugs and pharmaceuticals into drug discovery phase.
Mm-hmm. And so what's very interesting to me is we've talked about how the government had a visionary long-term plan in terms of investing in science and technology. We've talked about the capacity and the striving for excellence in terms of the Indian Institutes for Technology, using MIT as the benchmark of what they wanted to produce in India. And clearly what's been happening in the US is a reflection of the excellence that was strived for and achieved. But also there's another element that's been really important, are the business schools in India and their relationships with the government as well as the technology schools. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Along with the Indian Institutes of Technology, India has built up something like 5 or 6 business schools, and which is the Indian Institutes. They are known as Indian Institutes of Management. Mm-hmm. And again, many of these institutions were modeled on the US business schools. But many of these business schools draw a lot of engineering students from the Indian Institutes of Technology. And again, they have maintained a kind of excellence and quality of teaching, and putting certain meritorious quality of standards in terms of engineering and management education, these business schools.
And so what's interesting to me is how the interfacing of the business schools, the technology schools, and the government has created novel technologies, platforms, businesses that address bottom of the pyramid challenges and turned them into prosperous, market-driven solutions that give dignity to the poor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, here again, an area or a sector where India was able to sort of develop some benchmarks or exemplary cases is in terms of the inclusive innovation. As you are aware, more than nearly 400 to 500 million people are at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of earning $2 a day or something like that. So here the high technology or some of those technologies which India has developed may not be directly relevant in terms of enhancing their livelihood or something. Here again, India has particularly the non-governmental sector and some of the institutions have created certain exemplary cases in terms of inclusive innovation. One can talk about Barefoot College. One could talk about Self-Employment Women's Association. One can talk about the grassroots innovation honeybee network at the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad. And many of these institutions have developed technologies where the epistemological roots of this inclusive innovation, the success stories, goes back to the Gandhian notions of decentralized development and technology. And many of these institutions have created certain best practices in terms of training people at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of inclusive innovation.
Great. So there are two examples I'd be interested in if you could speak a little about. Amul, if you could speak about Amul or the cataracts surgery network in India. Are those things you could talk about?
Yeah. In addition to the Barefoot College and grassroots innovation of Honeybee Network, the Amul, which is the Anand Milk Union Limited, which is a kind of a cooperative sector in the milk, is a very glaring example in terms of inclusive innovation or in terms of an innovation which is within the cooperative sector, which enabled India to achieve milk production which has surpassed even the US, which is the largest producer of the milk. What is important in many of the Amul is a white revolution, where something like 14 million people are involved in hundreds and hundreds of cooperative societies, and many of these cooperative societies and the milk sort of all India based network in terms of they are based on what is known as a kind of a corporation, you see, which is sort of involved in at the village level, the whole network of the cooperatives, which is at the district level, which has spread into something like 20 states, which have achieved the milk revolution, which is one of the glaring examples of this thing. The other which you have mentioned is the Arvind Eye Care, where nearly they have so far, which is another example of the inclusive innovation, where they have conducted something like 3.5 million surgeries. This is something based on economy of scale and maintaining the quality and in terms of the eye surgeries and the cataracts. It's again a kind of a institution where you can the Gandhian philosophy has influenced in terms of the non-governmental organization, which is the Arvind Eye Care Clinic, which is involved in the whole serving the people at the bottom of the pyramid.
Well, I think that's great, Krishna, because we've covered how government has been involved in social innovation and science and technology policy. We've covered how technology institutes have been involved in the process, as well as business schools, as well as the nonprofit sector, how that has empowered the bottom billion in India, and as well examples in terms of the bottom billion on the planet, on ways we can move forward cooperatively, and also cut out a lot of corruption, because these are systems that show that smallholder farmers in networks can create products that are of international standard quality, that have cold chain storage that are adapted to smallholder farmer conditions, and produce a product of value that gives them guaranteed income, that allows them to thrive, to be able to take care of their families, and to predict.
Absolutely.
To predict how things are going forward. And so another thing I'd like to ask you about is in terms of electronic governance and corruption. Is there anything you can speak to in terms of how some of the innovations in governance in India have helped cut corruption and an increased level of service in the country?
In information technology has been used for transparency, actually, which is a glaring example again of how you can sort of bring down, difficult to eliminate corruption in any country, but to minimize it to the lowest levels. So the information technology has been used very extensively in terms of transparency in various other governmental services, in terms of delivering the benefits, in terms of the whole programs in allocating the projects, the whole government procurement in terms of mega projects in telecommunications, in the coal mines, auctioning of the coal mines, and the whole business. They are using information technology and in terms of transparency, which is brought down the corruption to a minimum level.
So you've talked about how leadership has been critical to promoting science and innovation policy in India. And I'd be interested, are there ways, in terms of the lessons learned, you've talked about the Gandhian paradigm, what could be lessons for Canada in terms of what they're doing in Canada as well in international development, and ways that Canadian innovation and science policy could be more effective to alleviate poverty and bring prosperity and sustainable development to more parts of the world?
When you look in terms of Canada and compare it with some of the OECD countries, Canada has not, Canadian investment into R&D in terms of its GDP has stagnated over the last decade, or little more than a decade, at 1.6%. Where a country like Canada could go up to more than 2 or 2.5% at the level of the OECD. I think that is one of the first thing. Secondly, I think there is a very good scope where countries like Canada could invest more into some of the areas like climate change and renewable energy, which could be a sort of a beneficial not only to the Canadian society but to the other parts of the country. And the other area where I think Canada could sort of collaborate and also learn from some of the other countries is in terms of where the indigenous knowledge could be linked to the modern knowledge, and where the traditional knowledge could be linked to the modern knowledge, and where there also there's a whole scope of the inclusiveness you can build in terms of through the science and technology, rather a blending of the science and technology, the traditional and the modern science and technology.
So really, Krishna, what I loved about what you said is policy related to science, innovation, and technology can be inclusive, can harness indigenous wisdom, and can include all sectors, all pillars of society, nonprofit, government, business, academic, non-academic. And I find it very, very interesting how this vision of leadership has grown into India really harnessing brain flow and contributing to development globally. And I really liked what you said around, well, one of the things Canada could contribute more to is research and development around renewable resources and innovative technologies related to climate change for the globe and for the planet. And so, you know, we've had a really interesting conversation here, and I just wanted to know, are there any last elements you'd like to have our listeners hear before we end this conversation?
Well, we are having this conversation in the Institute for the Study of International Development, and I'm teaching a course which is a kind of a course as a part of collaboration between India and Canada through the Indian Council for Cultural Relations chair here, course on science, technology and international development. I wish that it becomes a continuing course which is so important for Institute for Development Studies to have a course on science, technology and international development.
Thank you very much, Krishna. This has been wonderful talking to you, and thank you for all of you for watching this.
Thank you, Eliane.
Pleasure.